The Democracy Forum is a not-for-profit organisation founded in 2009 under the patronage of Baroness Nicholson of Winterbourne. Its principal goal was to work for the furtherance of democracy, peace and the rule of law in order to counter religious fundamentalism and intolerance in our global communities. In an increasingly fractured world, this goal continues to be the driving force behind all of the Forum's activities. Lord Charles Bruce is the current president of the Forum. Since its inception, the Forum has hosted and co-hosted seminars on a wide variety of topics relating to democracy and human rights across the world. The Democracy Forum encourages academics, students, journalists and other socially and politically conscious people to attend our seminars and to participate in the question and answer session. Details are available on our website, thedemocracyforumlimited.com.
Democracy Forum brings you another not-to-be-missed webinar. China's growing inroads into South Asia. The PRC's economic expansion in South Asia continues at pace, checking the rise of India and attempting to achieve its own ambitions through strategic infrastructure investment. As China, Pakistan and Afghanistan reaffirm their commitment to further trilateral cooperation under the BRI and to jointly extend the CPEC to Afghanistan, what might this mean for the region in terms of security, sovereignty and strategic concerns? To examine these and many other related questions, please join the debate at the Democracy Forum's live broadcast, with questions and comments for our expert panelists.
Hello, I'm Humphrey Hawksley and welcome, wherever you are in the world, to our Democracy Forum debate, China's growing inroads into South Asia. Here lies the driving question of Chinese expansion as it comes to face with the world's biggest democracy in India, which is being wooed by the United States but adheres rigidly to its doctrine of non-alignment. India will never have an alliance like Japan or South Korea. And what though of its enemy and Chinese ally, Pakistan, and the smaller South Asian nations who have signed up to Beijing's infrastructure building vision? Why? Is it because America and the West has come up with nothing to match it? To untangle and straighten out China's growing inroads into South Asia, we have a superb Democracy Forum panel. Sadia Sulaiman, Asanga Abeyagoonasekera, Aditya Shrivamurthy, and Rafaello Pantucci. A fifth panelist, Anwar, has had to drop out, unfortunately, because of an emergency. Democracy Forum Chair Barry Gardiner MP is following our debate, and he's a veteran of South Asia and of Chinese politics. He will deliver his assessment at the end. And as always, to give us the canvas and background of our discussion, we go to the president of the Democracy Forum, Lord Charles Bruce. Lord Bruce, the screen is yours.
Good afternoon and welcome to the webinar, which has been arranged to assess the nature and impact of China's activities in South Asia. For those of you who attend our events regularly, this is a recurrent topic, which we last covered in March, but has been given added prominence by the recent Foreign Ministers' Conference in Indonesia. In selecting such a relevant theme for the forum today, the team at the Democracy Forum has to be congratulated for inviting such an eminent group of panelists to discuss and debate the essential issues. I'm very grateful that everyone has agreed to take part. And on your behalf, I'd like to thank Humphrey Hawksley for taking the role of moderator. Hosting a meeting of the 30th ASEAN Regional Forum in Jakarta on the 14th of July, the Indonesian Foreign Minister, Retno Marsudi, commented on the systemic difficulties undermining trust between member states and concluded that, I quote, "sharpening rivalry continues to divide the region. Our region also hosts numerous potential flashpoints. This challenge is becoming more complicated," she warned, and she encouraged participants to strengthen preventative diplomacy not have been more emphatic. Of the 8 countries forming the South Asian bloc and represented by SAARC, the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, the Maldives, Nepal, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka, all are undoubtedly affected by China's growing inroads in this region. China's Belt and Road Initiative in South Asia involves all SAARC countries in subsidiary programs, such as the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, CPEC, the Bangladesh-China-India-Myanmar Economic Corridor, the Trans-Himalayan Corridor, and cooperation with Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and the Maldives under the 21st Century Maritime Silk Road. China is currently the largest trading partner in South Asia. The value of its trading activities increased from $93 billion in 2012 to $118 billion in 2018, when imports from the region reached $22.5 billion. But it is the relationship between India and China which continues to dominate any calculation of the balance of power in South Asia, as each pursues policies aimed at building military, economic, and political hegemony across the region. Attending the Jakarta Forum, Mr. Jaishankar, the Indian Foreign Minister, held a meeting with Wang Yi, the recently reappointed Chinese Foreign Minister, his 3rd meeting with a Chinese counterpart this year. Jaishankar addressed the military tension along the line of actual control in Ladakh, where frontier forces sustained many casualties following clashes in June 2020 and January 2021. And he made it abundantly clear, as a prerequisite to returning to normalcy in bilateral relations, China needs to demilitarize the LAC to prevent flashpoints from occurring in the future. And as if to lend weight to the points of contention raised at the Jakarta conference, the United States China Economic and Security Review Commission concludes in a recent report that the Chinese Communist Party's foreign policy objectives in South Asia are focused, I quote, on neutralizing India as a rival power. Indeed, a research paper published by the Stockholm Center describes in detail the methods used by China in pursuing this policy, where its diplomats, I quote, engage directly with India to downplay any tensions, while the People's Liberation Army maintains protracted and calculated tensions over disputed boundaries. Thus, the recent outbreak of aggression on the line of actual control provides clear evidence of a twin-track strategy, where in the first instance, the Chinese government has attempted to derail the boundary negotiation process as part of a calculated conflict that requires constant diplomatic attention from India, potentially distracting the country from other priorities in the region. And secondly, where the Chinese Communist Party attempts to create a strategic divide between India and other South Asian countries by trying to create dependencies on Chinese investment. Evidence of China's use of targeted activity in this manner in South Asia, in other parts of Asia and Africa, and its consequent effect on Indian development decisions has been published by the College of William and Mary in Virginia, which investigated 1,100 Indian government financed projects in over 4,000 locations within 93 countries from 2007 to 2014. And 3,500 Chinese-funded projects in over 6,000 subnational locations within 138 countries. And the report concluded, I quote, Delhi is more likely to increase its financial footprint in jurisdictions where it has recently become less popular relative to China. This is a pattern that is difficult to reconcile with any explanation other than competition with China. The survey of China's development-led diplomacy in South Asia, published by the Carnegie Endowment for World Peace, concludes that, I quote, China has developed more channels of influence as well as a greater expectation of deference to its interests and a greater willingness to exercise pressure in their pursuit. Indeed, one doesn't have to look far around the region to see where these obligations are piling up. Sri Lanka's accumulated loan commitments to China have reached 20% of its total public external debt. China holds around $30 billion of Pakistan's public debt, but shows a similar reluctance to cooperate with refinancing as it has demonstrated with Sri Lanka. And Pakistan is additionally hobbled by the contractual obligations it has accumulated under CPEC, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, particularly the capacity payments demanded by Chinese independent power producers. China is also a major investor in the Bangladesh economy, in 2016 offering a development package to accompany a state visit of Xi Jinping worth $24 billion. And furthermore, it's a leading supplier of military materiel, according to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, accounting for 70% of Bangladeshi arms purchases between 2016 and 2020. In Nepal, China has been active in advancing funds for major infrastructure projects, providing a soft loan in 2016 to augment the Pokhara International Airport, and recently announcing a feasibility study for a trans-Himalayan railway. Although Pokhara is a standalone agreement, China signed Nepal into the Belt and Road Initiative in 2017 and concluded a transit and transportation agreement 3 years later. But insidiously, China relies on Nepali cooperation to control migration from the Tibet Autonomous Region and to restrict the further growth of the Tibetan diaspora in India. As a diplomat explains, I quote, to realize its overarching aim of co-opting Buddhism across South Asia by seeking to persuade Nepal to recognize legitimacy of a future successor to the Dalai Lama as chosen by the Chinese authorities. So how does China measure the success of the role it is pursuing in South Asia? The Carnegie Endowment warns us that China's presence in this region may result in outcomes that will inevitably affect relationships between and within states. Thus, China's interest, I quote, is no longer predominantly economic, but involves a greater multi-dimensional effort to enhance its posture and further its long-term strategic interests. This has the potential to pit political and commercial elites against each other, and in the case of countries with fragile institutions, an undeveloped civil society, or elites susceptible to capture, this may eventually weaken the state itself. Well, thank you very much for choosing to watch this webinar today. If you have any comments or questions, please pass them to the chair.
Thank you, Lord Charles Bruce, for that rather chilling and insightful assessment, neutralizing India as a rival power, the sharpening rivalry, the lack of trust, all of that we're going to look into. Our first panelist is Dr. Sadia Sulaiman from Quaid-i-Azam University in Islamabad, and amongst her wide academic research, she covers the governance in fragile states. In one of her many articles, she has argued convincingly, as an example, that if Pakistan wants to show its people the benefits of China, it could start by building hospitals and medical facilities along the controversial China-Pakistan economic corridor. That is just a glimpse. Dr. Sadia Sulaiman, China's growing inroads into South Asia. What are the stakes?
Thank you very much. I hope I'm clearly audible to all of the online audience. And very good afternoon to everyone. And first of all, thank you, Honorable Chair and the Democracy Forum, for inviting me to talk on this prestigious forum on a very, very important topic. Today, my focus will be on how China-Pakistan economic corridor has been or will be extended into Afghanistan, and what sort of challenges this extension may carry for all the stakeholders, for China, Pakistan, and Afghanistan itself, importantly. But before indulging into that debate, I would first of all briefly introduce you to how Pakistan and China both view what is China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, or CPEC. As you might be aware that it's a very, very huge multi-billion project connecting China's Xinjiang province with the Gwadar port of Pakistan through a network of roads, air, nuclear and railway links and energy corridor. CPAC basically includes a variety of initiatives, including special economic zones, usually referred to as SEZs, industrial parks, energy plants, and agricultural and socio-economic development projects to foster the economic growth of Pakistan. In Pakistan, this project is expected to play a significant role in the development and prosperity of Pakistan and enhance China's regional and global connectivity as part of China's Belt and Road Initiative. In Pakistan, it was viewed initially, although currently it's faced with this standstill, but the CPAC was viewed as being offering diverse economic opportunities for Pakistan, especially for the common people at grassroots level, and it was usually termed as Marshall Plan for the economy of Pakistan, and it is expected that CPAC will provide millions of job opportunity to the local people, along with better health and education facilities as well. Originally planned to be completed somewhere in 2030, the overall CPAC project is currently fraught with delays due to the several economic, political, and security challenges, especially because of the economic and political instability and uncertainty in Pakistan and China's reluctance to basically refinancing or rescheduling the debt crisis of Pakistan, and secondly, because of the interconnected instability in neighboring Afghanistan, where the prospects of a civil war or continued instability because of the Taliban takeover after the US withdrawal in August 2021, all those factors are responsible for the delay in the CPAC project and its execution and implementation. There is a concern inside Pakistan that basically instability in Afghanistan will negatively impact the development of CPAC, and it would not inhibit the extension of the project into Central Asia. However, despite this concern, despite this fear, there were basically important meetings going on after the Taliban took over the power in Afghanistan in order to extend this CPAC project into Afghanistan. And as Pakistan, China, and Afghanistan have reiterated their interest and concern and reiterated their policy option that they would extend CPAC into Afghanistan. However, this entire project, which if extended into Afghanistan, although it will be a good omen for the people of Afghanistan who are currently faced with the immense humanitarian crisis, but it is not without certain challenges. And I would like to identify 4 core challenges which basically this extension scheme would face in the future and is facing currently as well. Number 1 challenge which the CPAC extension into Afghanistan is because of the complex geopolitical scenario of this region. As discussed in the introduction by the president of the Democracy Forum and by the chair, honorable chair, basically China wants to play a role in a region which is already fraught with several bilateral and multilateral conflicts or disputes among the states. For example, we cannot ignore, we cannot deny the fact that Pakistan and India, their health of relationship is not at all good. And India is always concerned about Chinese CPAC project and its extension into Afghanistan. And Pakistan has remained very, very sensitive of Indian presence in Afghanistan throughout the 20 years of US stay and their engagement earlier with the Karzai regime and later on with the Ghani regime. So that kind of a mistrust and that kind of a relationship does not allow for kind of a regional activity which would involve more connectivity, which would involve the regional states to be connected to each other. The regional geopolitical complexity would not allow the plan or the scheme of CPAC extension into Afghanistan that much easily. And most importantly, this region has a history of conflict rather than of of connectivity. I mean, the SARC platform has remained unable to connect the regional states of South Asia. Earlier, Afghanistan was not part of it, the SARC, but after 2001, Afghanistan became part of the SARC organization, which is the South Asian Regional Organization platform. But somehow such platforms even could not stimulate the desire for more connectivity among the regional states. So in such a situation, how would China or Pakistan, or for that matter, Afghanistan, would basically vie for a more regional kind of a network with a lot of connectivity, engaging people, engaging businesses, engaging governments? That is yet to be seen. Second important challenge in this regard is the persistent instability in Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, the instability is multidimensional. If we start with the economic instability, there's no hidden fact that basically China, from day one after the US invasion of Afghanistan back in 2001, China also made certain efforts to have a kind of an economic footings in Afghanistan, and especially after Taliban took power in August 2021, China signed various deals with the Taliban regime. For example, in January 2023, China signed a contract to extract oil in the north of the country by investing some $150 million annually. And there are basically interest on part of China to extract the mineral resources of Afghanistan and use them for the global outreach and for the economic prosperity of Afghanistan. But the consistent and persistent political and economic instability, humanitarian crisis, and Taliban regimes, I would say, harsh stance towards human rights, especially the women's rights, basically has resulted in reluctance on part of the international community to engage with the Taliban. Even Pakistan, I mean, which has been considered as the major country who supported Taliban throughout, Pakistan has not recognized Afghanistan or Taliban regime so far. So it shows that there are huge concerns on part of the regional countries and part of the global community equally on how to address the issue of political and economic instability and uncertainty in Afghanistan. And on top of that, Afghanistan is still I would say marred with seeds of the extremism and terrorism. ISIL, ETIM, Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan, TTP, they are still very much active inside Afghanistan, and these such militant outfits or organizations are a huge source of concerns for China and Pakistan both. Even Pakistan with the Taliban regime could not enjoy smooth and friendly relationship when they came into power in August 2021 because of the presence of the TTP on the Afghan soil and how they have been using it against Pakistan's security interests. So this kind of an insecurity is another, I would say, another source of complexity in this entire plan to extend or expand CPAC via Afghanistan into Central Asia and so on. So the instability in Afghanistan is a second huge challenge which would need to be considered or addressed by any country, whether it's China or Pakistan or a combination of these two, to complete or fulfill the interest of the expansion of the CPAC into this region. Third important challenge, in my opinion, is the in a way, the instability or political uncertainty at the moment inside Pakistan. We know that in the previous regime of Imran Khan, because of the immense security concerns and especially because of the dam attack on the Chinese worker in the Gilgit-Baltistan, the CPAC project came to a standstill. And the new regime, when it came into power after the vote of no confidence in April last year, so basically they have have been trying to restore the confidence of the Chinese side, and to an extent they have remained successful. That now there are news coming in that maybe the work on the special economic zones, the work on the remaining road link projects, especially in the KP province, would continue. And so this basically but we have to keep in mind that Pakistan is going through a kind of a transition in which elections are just around the corner. In few days time, this government would announce the interim government, and economically the situation of Pakistan is not at all a hidden thing. It's going through, it was at the verge of an economic meltdown, but thanks to the IMF tranche which came in this month. So but still, I mean, Pakistan has to go through Pakistan may take a longer time, I would say, to re-strengthen, to rejuvenate itself in order to get maximum benefit out of such project. At the moment, the key concern is to attain a level of a political stability, political certainty after the elections and all that stuff. And this government is even trying to expand the mandate of the caretaker government, because the economic situation requires that there should be persistency in the policy. So that's another real concern, that this persistent, I would say, I would use the term fragility inside Pakistan, is not allowing it to look into other direction. Although there is a will, there is a desire, but how Pakistan can basically untap its resources, use its potential as a hub of the regional connectivity in order to expand CPEC, it is yet to be seen. And much depends upon the new government which will come into power somewhere in the end of this year. Last but not the least, for me, the key challenge is the experience of China. For China, it's very important to engage with the countries, or we have seen China engaging with the countries in the region, and in terms of CPEC with Pakistan and now with Afghanistan, on the basis of economic interest and on the basis of economic growth or connectivity or attaining such objectives. But we know that in this kind of a world where we are living, economic policies are very much interconnected with the socio-political, socio-cultural, and all those aspects of the policy making. China, in my opinion, has a very less experience of engaging with the rest of the world in terms of as a peace broker, as a political stakeholder. And we have seen that China usually has adopted a policy of non-interference. So how this lack of experience in reconstructing the post-conflict states like Afghanistan, in engagement politically with any neighboring country and influencing their decision making, not in a negative sense, but maybe to facilitate the political transition process like in Pakistan, how this lack of experience would allow China to deal with such kind of a complex region in which we are living currently. So in my opinion, all these four challenges, when combined together, they make a very, very complex situation. But of course, we cannot deny the fact that if CPEC has been materialized, as I always look at CPEC from a very, very socio-economic perspective, and as I always try to see the other side of the picture, where this project would bring in the trickle-down impact for the common people, where the people may get benefit not only in the form of the economic opportunities, but better health opportunities, better educational opportunities, because I belong to the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province, which is a gateway to Afghanistan from Pakistan. And so far, we haven't seen any of the CPEC project completed in that region. But the region is resource scarce region. It's financially in crisis. And if a project like CPEC is there and it's like implemented in its true spirit, so maybe it will have positive implications for the people by constructing the roads, by better connectivity. And through this better connectivity, people have the ease of access to the hospitals, to the schools, to the colleges, to the technical institutions. And most importantly, in that region, people have the business of the cargoes, and they also have the transportation business. So such people will get benefit out of this connectivity move. But it is yet to be seen that how things unfold in this region, and how CPAC unfold in this particular area, and how we can get through all of these four core challenges. So I would stop here, and if you have any questions, so please forward them to Humphrey. Thank you, Humphrey.
Sadia, Sulaiman, thank you so much for that. That was absolutely brilliant. It really put things in perspective. Can I ask you a tangential question, but it might have a bearing? What do you read into the sacking of Foreign Minister Jin Gang and the return of Wang Yi, and as to what we're talking about? Will it have any influence at all, or not, do you think?
For me, foreign policies or policies in countries like China, the personal influences are of course here, but we have to look at the China's policy in a broader perspective, where there are certain broader global or regional goals, and they have remained similar for the past several years. Yeah. So I don't think so that it would change effectively or broadly anything, but I see the consistency in the policy of China so far.
And which brings me to what would you think is their end game in making inroads into Afghanistan that you gave us such a vivid example of? Do they want to create a sort of vassal state like, say, Cambodia or Laos, or do they want? Can you give us an idea of what they want to achieve there?
There are basically 7 bottlenecks which connects Pakistan or Afghanistan-Pakistan borderland region with Afghanistan, broadly speaking. And there is a lot of work going on these 7 transport routes, and it would be a road connecting, basically roads and railways, then later on they will come in. So they are also I have met some of the government officials, and they were telling me that maybe they will be establishing some kind of an economic zones on those gateways which connect Pakistan and Afghanistan. So there will be kind of special economic zones promoting the local businesses, promoting the people-to-people contacts, business-to-business contacts, and so on. But it is yet to be materialized. As I have told you that in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province, in KP province, which connects Pakistan and Afghanistan, so far we haven't seen any properly completed CPAC project. So
okay, no, that's interesting. So it's basically trade, influence, supply chain sort of stuff. It's not ideological colonialism, which is what.
No. It's basically yeah.
And finally, a message for one of our audience, Prashant Kumar, because you mentioned that it's more into conflict than connectivity in South Asia. What is China's influence on the dynamics of conflict in South Asia, and can it broker peace?
As I mentioned in my last point, that China has lack of experiment or experience in this regard with engaging as a peace broker role. But recently we have seen that China has played a role in bringing together Taliban and Pakistan, because they were having disagreement over the negotiation with the TTP, right? And China played a role where Pakistanis and Taliban stakeholders were made to sit together and decide about how to go about this problem of the cross-border terrorism. And we also witnessed that China has played a role in Iran, Saudi Arabia, bringing them together. So it's a sign that yes, China may play such kind of a role in this region. But as I've told you, this region is very, very complex. I mean, the conflicts and disagreements are multi-layered, multi-dimensional, and historically very deep-rooted, and ideological in a sense as well. So how China would cope with it, it's yet to be seen.
Yeah, experience, I think, is a big issue there. And of course, if it was successful over the decades in doing that, it would have much more global influence, as the US has had in some. Thank you so much for that. Please stay with us, because we will be returning to your wisdom. And our next panelist comes to us from Washington, DC, Asanga Abeyagoonasekera, Executive Director of the South Asia Foresight Network at the Millennium Project in Washington, and a young global leader at the World Economic Forum, although he did say he wasn't quite so young when we were discussing that. He is the author of numerous books, including the most recent, which is Teardrop Diplomacy, China's Sri Lankan Foray, or I should say perhaps infrastructure diplomacy. Asanga, Abeyagoonasekera, share what you know.
Thank you so much, Humphrey, and thank you for the invitation. So I'll straight away go to my slides. I have some slides prepared. So I will discuss about China's inroads into South Asia and particularly Sri Lanka, and how it's been a year of the crisis, I mean, the people's uprising in Sri Lanka. It was last in July. The autocratic leader was removed by the general public of Sri Lanka for the first time in its political history, where you would see that a massive public uprising against Gotabaya Rajapaksa, which actually, succeeded. And my book, The Teardrop Diplomacy, is actually dedicated to those brave, protesters who walked into the president's residence as well as the office, and who wanted democratic change to the country, and also sort of, the reforms, the system change that they were asking. What they were asking was a political, cultural change to this, corrupt, autocratic rule. So basically, how much was China involved was the sort of the analysis I bring in the book. And China is not the only cause for the political economic crisis, but a considerable cause. When I look at basically from my research as well as the findings, it was very clear that the economic diplomacy that was carried out by China had a sort of a significant impact for the dysfunctionality of the democratic system, as well as the economic contributing to economic, the large amount of debt that Sri Lanka has, as Lord Bruce mentioned, 20%. Again, unsustainable projects. We could not pay back most of those projects. Some of these projects are shut down, like the Matala International Airport built, but no flights coming in, built ignoring the EIAs, the environmental impact assessments, the processes, the informal processes, and how weak they are. There were three factors that I clearly found. I find in the Sri Lankan case, which is the unsustainable projects, as well as no revenue to repay the large amounts of borrowings. Some of the borrowings, now some actually debunk this debt trap theory, so I'm not with them. Actually, there is a debt trap clearly in Sri Lanka, and the revenues models are very different. The loans, the interest rates, for example, in the Hambantota port, which was built by China and leased out for 99 years by China. So if you compare one particular loan package was about 6.5%, very high interest rates. So some of them actually, they compare these with the Japanese loans and say, look, they are equal and there's no debt trap. So I don't agree with that. Chinese loans are completely different to the Japanese loans. Their conditionalities are very different. And so you cannot compare. The second area is no proper oversight. The informal processes that China introduced, for example, when they wanted to, acquire the special economic zone, and they did it during the COVID time. There was no debate. There was not much of discussion. The general public has not seen any of these agreements, including the Hambantota 99-year lease agreement. This pattern is not only in Sri Lanka, but I see it in other countries. One of the countries that I highlight was Solomon Islands. So in that, I think I sort of got it right about Solomon Islands when I wrote it sometime back then that there would be multiple security agreements in Solomon Islands, just like how Sri Lankan case, how it happened in Sri Lanka, these things would happen. And 2 weeks ago, you could see 9 agreements signed in Beijing with Solomon Islands president and prime minister. One of them was the law enforcement. So there you go. So that's the informal processes that China built are quite strong, and that helps to capture the elites, the political elites, as well as elite capture. This is highlighted by Carnegie report that I think Lord Bruce mentioned about that. The next area is the China strategic trap. So what I say is, like, I go beyond sort of the debt trap, and I see a strategic trap. And what is a strategic trap? It has 3 areas, basically. So one is political funding to political parties, so which happened during Rajapaksa, which is the former president, the political party, the CCP, direct involvement in the political party. So it comes to a point that the former president says that we need to have a new model. And he says this to President Xi, saying that we need to introduce a new development model. And what we have with the existing model is not working. So it comes to a point that it wants to sort of bandwagon with the Chinese foreign policy and or China. So and it was very clear in the Sri Lankan case. And you could see one of the papers that I wrote on this particular area is published by CSEP. So you could say the Communist Party of China and its political influence. So there I go in detail how much of funding has come in and how much of influence has China built. And you could see minting a coin for the CCP centenary. Then you have workshops done by the CCP. So it's kind of departing from the democratic model. If you look at the Sri Lankan case, there were structural adjustments done to the constitution, such as amending, so bringing in power more towards the center, which is the executive, and getting away with the independent institutions of the country, the bribery, corruptions, as well as heavily influencing. And you have multiple sort of interventions to the bureaucracy, as well as heavy militarization. The second is the human rights support that countries like Sri Lanka and many others receive from China. And reciprocally, Sri Lanka also sort of, speaks about China's human rights concerns, such as the Foreign Secretary's statement, which was during the Rajapaksa era. You could see that Sri Lanka supporting Chinese human rights issues. So it's kind of a reciprocal arrangement. The third is the military and the security assistance, which is a serious area impacting the national security of Sri Lanka, as well as what I mentioned earlier, Solomon Islands. So the domestic political environment is very important to understand. I know there's a lot of economic discussion about the economic dysfunctionality, how it happened, the large amounts of borrowings, the liquidity issue, the insolvency issue, but not much of attention is given to the political environment. So the structural change, how a democratic country became in less than 2 years, an autocratic country, the heavy militarization, the family rule, the intervention of judiciary, the media freedom, the human rights abuse of the minority, and heavy corruption. So those are all the sort of pillars that I capture in my book, and so I won't go into detail, but I'll just highlight a few. This is the family rule in Sri Lanka. This is the first time we had the sibling regime where the president and the prime minister were brothers, and then the other brothers were holding the key ministries, the finance ministry, as well as many other ministries. So it was a family regime that we had. And then you have 28 military appointments in the government sector. So military, like former retired major generals were controlling prices of, as in daily commodities, as well as, so the COVID environment gave sort of that, the space for this, basically the heavy militarization to happen. And there was only one country that was supporting this model, which was China. So clearly the data points in my book captures that how much was the support given by China. And you could see there's a considerable amount of support given by China for this model. And when you look at the region, so basically, if you look at Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Bangladesh, all of these countries, how much do they support the Chinese policy on BRI, support on the Hong Kong issue, for example. All of these countries sort of, yes, they do support the Hong Kong national security laws. Some of them abstain. 2 countries abstain, Maldives and Afghanistan. Support on Chinese stance on South China Sea arbitral ruling. So yes, so most of them either they support or be neutral. Does not go against China. The support for Chinese stance in Xinjiang policies, almost all of the South Asian countries does support, as well as 3 countries abstain: Bangladesh, Maldives, and Afghanistan. Support on the Huawei 5G, which is another area that impacts the national security. For example, the Sri Lankan telecommunications network, which is about the backbone, is about 80% is controlled by Huawei. And there's a serious issue because multiple proposals that we used to receive from Huawei, for example, on surveillance, has a serious issue on the national security. So you could see the support, almost all of the countries have supported the Huawei. So China has actually won in South Asia. I see basically my analysis clearly states that China has sort of managed to capture this from diplomatic, of course, the economic diplomacy, as well as the 3 areas that China speaks on, which is the GSI, the Global Security Initiative, which President Xi has been speaking about, as well as the GDI, the Global Development Initiative, which is the BRI and all the development projects. As Sadia mentioned, going into areas without no development, developing highways, winning the people, has been sort of the main goal. And China's been successful, although there are processes, the issues in processes, as well as, the limitations. General public does accept sort of to an extent, like building highways, making their lives better. So the GCI is the next one, which is the global, the cultural side. So how much China supports on the cultural context, such as from the institutes that they have, as well as the research institutes. So how much the cultural support that they receive. So you could see a significant increase in all 3 areas in South Asia. And so China has managed to win this from the soft power diplomacy. It has, as well as the elite capture in countries like in Sri Lanka. So the large amounts, like the corruption is a huge problem. The informal processes they built, they managed to win tenders. They managed to sort of, bring in, sign in agreements that no one has seen, the general public has seen. So it's kind of, there's no sort of clear due diligence process in these sort of projects. And that's a clear weakness that these countries have. Since US and I could see like a trend that there's much focus on Ukraine as well as on these in the war in Ukraine, and there is a kind of open space for China in the Indo-Pacific, and you could see that from the agreement that was signed in Solomon Islands, that yes, there is a space that is that's emerging to China in Indo-Pacific. Which is kind of threatening to democratic space, actually. And Chinese agency in South Asia has grown. I mean, you could see clearly in Pakistan's case, the CPEC, which Sadia mentioned, as well as many other countries like Bangladesh, Nepal, the airport, for example, the Maldives, and many other countries. The domestic policies are really on, for example, the new terrorism bill, which are going against the trend of democracy, obviously, because you'll be able to arrest anybody under the national security pretext, and this would sort of harm the democratic processes as well as the democratic institutions that Sri Lanka has. And unfortunately, these bills, such as the Broadcasting Act, which is introduced by the present regime. Now, the present regime is a kind of a hybrid regime with the previous one. So when the president resigned, he appointed somebody from the parliament who had 1 seat, which is a bonus seat. And this is the first time again in the Sri Lankan history, somebody with a bonus seat has become the president. not elected but appointed. So you see all these new acts coming in, but I kind of see a trend like with other South Asian countries like Bangladesh, the DSA, the Digital Security Act, which has arrested more than so many the critiques, as well as so there is kind of a trend of freedom of expression being suppressed in these countries. So an alternative to democratic model due to debt distress and economic conditions. So almost all these countries are now going to IMF assistance, and IMF has assisted Sri Lanka. There is a lot of good economic measures being taken, but unfortunately, they are sort of vulnerable to democratic backsliding. And so I will stop there, I think. Thank you so much.
Thank you. That was fascinating, particularly that slide you had on the support on these key issues, that in the West, we have a very different view, particularly on Xinjiang, than comes out of South Asia. This is an impossible question, but I'm going to put it to you anyway. Is China more in tune with the thinking of South Asia when it comes to issues like Xinjiang, human rights, and all of that sort of thing? Or is it just a transactional buy-off because there's this renminbi economy and bribes swirling around?
No, I think there's two ways to look at it. One is the successful economic diplomacy they have carried out. The large amounts of borrowings, of course, has worked in these countries to capture the elites. So the elite capture actually has given a space for China to sort of, bringing the support from these countries towards their policies. So what Carnegie report did was capturing how much of that was there in the elite capture, which again, I also contributed to that report. But how it sort of translates into, getting the host countries to support the Chinese policies is what I did, the analysis. So I found that almost all of these countries does support because of the, the political protectionism, as well as the human rights support, as well as, all that, what they receive from China.
Yes. So that there's an element of both, really, because the human rights records of Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and all that, it is not to Western standards anyway, is it? So, I mean, it's not as if they're retreating back from something. From what you said there, the inroads, so they're not just inroads, they're there and tarmac down and motorways, basically, that China has got everywhere apart from India. Is that right?
Correct. The BRI is not in India, but then almost all the other countries. So, if you look at the immediate periphery of India, they're sort of very successfully captured the the main, I would say, the artery points, which is the ports, the logistic points. They've been very successful. In Sri Lanka, basically the 2 points, which is the closest point to Colombo Harbour, which is the port city, the special economic zone. They got the approval and everything during the COVID time. So there was no discussions or nothing. So they managed to get that, the extra jurisdictional sort of rights to control that.
And we heard earlier, the unrest that there is constantly, almost, with the most recent unrest in Pakistan, and you mentioned the riots and the overthrow in Sri Lanka. Is this in China's interests, or is it not what China wants?
No, it's definitely not what China wants, because China wants. You could see that China was supporting the previous leader, and it went completely sort of underground after they toppled the regime. So right now, what happened is that when certain democratic processes are not sort of, I would say, adhered or taken forward, what Sri Lanka needs is an elected leader. So here is a problem what we have. So the constitutionally, although it is allowed for a person who has one seat in the parliament to sort of rule the country, but ethically it is not right to have sort of one person, who who has a bonus seat in the parliament to become president.
I mean, it's
So,
a family dynasty.
But then China does not say anything on these issues. They just watch. Then they have a time to question, also saying, look, have you sort of stick to your democratic, processes and all that. And so it's kind of, China's been very smart, I would say. So they went completely underground. So now they're watching what's going on.
Yeah.
And sorry.
Can I just, Philip Bowman in the audience here has a question, which I think you partly answered, but in the firing line between China and India, how should Sri Lanka navigate its precarious position?
That's an important question, actually. So the most important question on our foreign policy is to have a balance. I mean, we were in a non-aligned country, so we always had a sort of a balanced foreign policy. So the previous regime, what happened was start speaking about China and sort of bandwagoning, I call it, because when the foreign secretary starts speaking about defending China's human rights and speaking in behalf of China, that was the first time that Sri Lanka did that. So you could see that a significant tilt and a danger and threatening India's foreign policy, which is inviting the spy ships, for example, which happened to the Hambantota port, the Chinese spy ship. So you could see, I mean, there are military ships. They are not civilian ships. They are hybrid use ships. So one of the reports in the Chatham House, for example, they say that there is no debt trap because the military ships can't enter Hambantota. That is incorrect. It was a military ship, but it has a hybrid sort of a functionality.
Of course, India can't match what China's doing, can it? It can't build the ports, or it's not building the ports, the airports, the peddling the influence like India is, like China is.
No, I mean, here's the thing that India can introduce. I mean, obviously the democratic processes, the get out of these informal processes that Sri Lanka was following, which is signing agreements on weekends for 99 years and all that. So it cannot match the volume, like you said, Humphrey, but it can bring in some sort of, democratic norms as well as the principles and improve the processes. So it's not about matching the numbers here, but also improving the quality. I think the IMF will add that layer. When it comes to sort of, countries like Sri Lanka, Pakistan, what's been missing, the large amounts of corruption. So you could see in these countries, so was because of the elite capture.
Thank you so much for that. Hang around. We will be coming back to you and listening, because we're going to even smaller countries now with Aditya Shivamurthy of the Strategic Studies Program at the Observer Research Foundation. He specializes in strategic security and developments in South Asia, India's relations with the region, and foreign policy of South Asian states. But his focus today is on China's inroads into two of South Asia's smallest states, Bhutan and the Maldives. Aditya Shivamurthy, put all that in context for us.
Thanks, Humphrey, and thanks the Democracy Forum for having me. Well, since my fellow panelists have already spoken about Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Afghanistan, I think I have very less but a huge task to speak about the two microstates that have hardly been discussed in other regions except for South Asia. Now, that is namely Maldives and Bhutan. South Asia, as it stands, is at the heart of geopolitical contestation, is at the heart of Indo-Pacific. This comes in geographically, structurally, as well as geopolitically. And in given this precarious position, given this crucial positioning, it is crucial that, to see how China is influencing or trying to make its inroads in both of these countries. To slightly introduce where Maldives and Bhutan are and what the current situation is. So essentially, both of these countries are located in quite an opposite direction with significant geographical disparity. Maldives is a small island nation located at the center of Indian Ocean. It doesn't border China. It is to the south of India and also to Sri Lanka, but it is crucially located to the sea lines of communications of the Indian Ocean, where most of the trade takes place. Now, why Maldives is important is because for a long time, India and Maldives have enjoyed a significant relationship. And since it's located at the heart of the Indian Ocean, it offers China an opportunity to counter, Indian influence and India's, relationship with the Maldives, and rather challenge the status of India as the regional power and establish itself as an Asian power, and also as an Indo-Pacific power. Now that also traces back to its Indo-Pacific strategy and how it wants to fend itself, or how it wants to circle around India and the rest of the key Indian Ocean states. Now the second part of it is Bhutan, quite opposite to Maldives. It's a landlocked nation. It's a very small nation which borders India and China. Now, what sets apart Bhutan from Maldives is that Bhutan has an immediate border problem with China. Now, slightly confronting what my previous panelists and Humphrey also said, Bhutan is not a part of BRI. Bhutan has never been a part of Belt Road Initiative. In fact, Bhutan is one of the few countries in the world which has not yet had a diplomatic relationship with China. There's no Bhutanese embassy in China, and Bhutan has never let a Chinese mission be established in Bhutan. Now, this essentially is the reason why China wants to make its successful inroads into Bhutan, for the very reason that Bhutan has hesitated to have a deep relationship with China and not solve its border disputes, and also not have a diplomatic mission within China, is something that questions China's so-called Asian hegemony, or so-called the leadership that it wants to embrace in the Indo-Pacific region. Now that has essentially shaped out how China is treating Bhutan, which I'll cover eventually. Now, the second point and the most important point that I want to bring to your notice is that Chinese presence in South Asia isn't new. But that said, its presence has magnified, its influence has doubled or tripled. In fact, since 2000s, ever since it has begun on an economic onset journey, its economic influence has taken a massive hold over the rest of South Asia, except for Bhutan, till recently. Now, this is where a lot of speculations come in, and a lot of Chinese inroads can be traced to. Speaking of Maldives first, Maldives and China established their diplomatic relationship in 1972. Still being under the dictator Mohammad Gayoom, Maldives tried to have a friendly relations with China, but keeping it at a distance. Gayoom became the first Maldivian president to visit China in 1984 and in 2006. But most of this relationship was also based on technology transfer and tourism and building basic infrastructure such as housing projects, etc. And in the later years, as the democratic movement tried making inroads in Maldives, Gayoom went on to China to seek their favor against the democratic movement, and also to seek sympathy from China. But that said, it was still quite a pro-Indian foreign policy, and also it kept itself quite a distant from China. Now, what works in favor of China is its economic diplomacy, as Asanga has rightly pointed out. More than economic diplomacy, it's also its economic might that a lot of South Asians countries feel that they can't avoid. In fact, not only South Asia, but the rest of the world feels they are interconnected and linked with China economically. Now, that is a risk that none of the South Asian countries want to take. They, in fact, want to have this close relationship so that they can get whatever economic leverages they could get from China, although at the cost of democracy. So essentially, when Maldives evolved into a democratic country, despite the first, Nasheed being the first democratic president in the Maldives, the relationship survived with China. There were a bit of, smaller projects that were given off to China, such as housing projects. But Nasheed's period also saw a Chinese embassy being established in Malé. Now, this was the first time a Chinese mission was being established in Maldives, and this again comes back to the fact that none of the countries actually want to keep China out of their agency display, and also to seek economic leverages from China. The moment China had a major breakthrough in Maldives was in 2012, 2013, and the following years till 2018. Now, this was the reason because Nasheed's successor were quite pro-China, and especially with the political instability that unfolded with a military coup that ousted Nasheed in 2012. It was majorly China that made inroads with the new president and with the new government, and tried pushing in several projects, including a major airport reconstruction project. Now, this expanded in the following years after Yamin, who became the fourth president of the Maldives during in between 2013 to 2018. But this is something that, again, I'll come back in the next point that I want to discuss. Now, following Yamin, Soli became the next president, who is also the incumbent president of the Maldives. During Soli's time, China has had its limited influence, but the debt trap that China had created during Yamin's period, where they were completely pro-Yamin, that's where China continues to hang on to Maldives. That's where China continues to pressurize on the Maldives. That's where it continues to invest in the Maldives. Now, that has been a sort of challenge to the Maldivian government as well. In fact, as soon as President Soli came in, he went on to India to seek financial assistance, because they knew during Yamin's time, in the period of 5 years, China had made major inroads, and also had unsustainably lent so many projects that Maldives was literally on the edge of being bankrupt. That's also, it was a closer case to the debt trap diplomacy that Asanga has explained previously, although it didn't really fall to that horrible phase thanks to the change in the government. But that was the case pretty much till 2018, and thanks to Soli government, that now Maldives has had a India first policy, and it's trying to maintain and strike a pro-India foreign policy, but also somewhat a balance with Beijing, because obviously of the economic leverages it holds, and also of the economic benefits that it could potentially bring. Now, while Maldives' case is of debt trap diplomacy, on the other hand, Bhutan's case has been a case of survival. Now, Bhutan has a tradition of not having its diplomatic relations with any of the P5 powers. That includes China. But unfortunately, it borders China, and it's a landlocked country that borders China, which has a few border disputes, essentially, which chunks up to nearly 20 to 25% of Bhutan's existing territory if China's successful claims have been successful. Now, the major conflict or major disruption between Bhutan and China's relations emerged when Tibet was invaded in 1949. After which successive Chinese governments, and even in the initial days of the communist movement, Mao Zedong consistently made this statement of 5 fingers, where basically China was supposed to take control of Nepal, Bhutan, Sikkim, Arunachal Pradesh, and the Jammu Kashmir region. That's basically the Ladakh region where the recent Galwan Valley standoff took place. Now, this is what triggered alarms in Bhutan. Starting from 1950s, it continued distancing itself. It continued integrating itself with Indian economy and with Indian leadership and with Indian ambitions as well. But after that, Chinese intrusions has only increased. Unfortunately, since 1950s, China introduced multiple maps showing certain territories of Bhutan as territories of China, and which it claims historically belong to Tibet. Now, these territories are in the north and the north of the central part of Bhutan, and also the eastern part of Bhutan. And only in 2019 did China make new claims in the western part of Bhutan again. Now, this was a very interesting development, considering that Bhutan and China had begun their negotiations on border disputes, and the western part of the dispute was never negotiated. In fact, it was acknowledged that the western part of the Bhutan was integral part of Bhutanese territory. But in 2019, we see China pushing up a lot of pressure against Bhutan for this very reason, that it wants to solve its border disputes so that it could, show itself as an Asian hegemon. Now, since 1984, both Bhutan and China have had 24 rounds of negotiation, and throughout these negotiations, none of these claims had ever been put forth, especially on the Western Front. And this was the first time in 2019 that the Western Front demands were put forth. This was a violation of the 1998 agreement, which, although assured Bhutan as a sovereign state, and China recognized Bhutan as a sovereign state, but also both of the states had agreed that they would maintain a status quo in the border, which China has refused to adhere with. China has been consistently making new claims. China has been making inroads into Bhutan. Now I'll discuss about that in the next part of the on the opening remarks. But overall, it just seems that China's aims in Bhutan has been solving its territorial disputes, claiming borders, trying to establish economic linkage and economic trade with Bhutan, because Bhutan also borders with Tibet, which, although is integral part of China, has still been socio-economically speaking poor compared to the other parts of China. And China sees basically Nepal and Bhutan as an opening parts where it could open up trade with the with the Tibetan lands, and basically try to improve the socio-economic lives of the Tibetan population, and also the population that has been settled in Tibet. So now that is why Bhutan has become so important for China to be consistently bullied through. Now, the second part of the remark that I want to make is something that's related to the Chinese tactics. Chinese tactics in South Asia have largely differed, depending on politics, depending on how the countries and how the leadership of those countries have reciprocated. Now, speaking of Maldives, the first and immediate opportunity that China was presented was political instability in the Maldives. As soon as it sensed political instability, and as soon as it sensed that there is no strong leader who could stand up against consistent Chinese investments, they made inroads in Maldives. Obviously, that also had to do with the elite capture part that came handy to China as soon as the new Yamin government took over Maldives in 2013. Now, with Yamin government, there has been a consistent economic interaction since 2013 to 2018. China tried multiple ways to make its inroads into Maldives. First thing, it tried signing a free trade agreement. In fact, it signed a free trade agreement with the Maldives. And then in 2014, Xi Jinping visited Maldives when Yamin was the president. And in fact, Maldives also became a part of the Belt Road Initiative. Now, ever since the relationship increased, China continued offering major projects with high interest rates, with high commercial market interest rates of borrowing. So basically, overall, it tried pushing Maldives against India, and eventually Maldives also had to make multiple calls where it had tried to push back against India and India's development assistance, and also India's military helicopter, which were deployed for humanitarian operations. So Maldives continued pushing back against India, and at the same point of time, the consistent borrowing from China continued pushing Maldives towards the debt trap that it was trying to create. Now, in fact, there are even cases where China has lent money to certain Maldivian businessmen on sovereign guarantees from the Maldivian government, and that also has come in handy after that has been politicized and weaponized after Yamin left and the new government came in. The Chinese government tried pushing against the new government, saying that you're a particular politician, a particular businessman from Maldives hasn't paid over $10 million and the government has to repay it. It is this way that China is trying to bully smaller countries, and obviously. Even during this period, Yamin, since he had so much support coming from China, there was a huge democratic backsliding within the country. He tried arresting President Nasheed. He arrested most of the senior leadership in the country, and which basically deemed them ineligible to contest in next presidential elections. He declared an emergency coup, he declared an emergency against a Supreme Court ruling, and this was all consistently supported by China. Now, this democratic backsliding obviously didn't go well with India, which had been a partner of Maldives evolving into a democratic country. But in 2018, when India tried coercive diplomacy against Maldives, or attempted to try coercive diplomacy against Maldives, in fact, Yamin had sent a special representative to China, and eventually we saw Chinese ships making their roads into Indian Ocean just so that they could push back against India and India's coercive diplomatic tactics. Now that is where China has made its road. everywhere it sends some agency being portrayed by smaller countries where they want to basically push back against India, where they basically want to push back against Indian projects and investments. China has made a major gain out of it. And it's not only economic, but following the economic inroads, Beijing has also made major inroads into Maldivian media, Maldivian politics, certain political parties such as the Progressive Party that is being led by Yamin, and also the media houses which have been consistently running an anti-India campaign called India Out. Now this has been consistently supported by Beijing. In fact, one of my paper that was written on India Out campaign traces that there is some deep interlinkage between the Xinhua, Global Times, and some of the Maldivian news outlets which continue to be pro Yamin, pro PPM party run by Yamin, and against India. So this is where the democratic backsliding continues to take place even till date. Although Yamin is not in the power, but the fact is that China has made deep inroads into Maldives, and also especially using the opposition ecosystem that is from the Progressive Alliance, that's what they call themselves. And as they head to elections, China is continuing to wait and watch on how to play with this tactic and how to exploit this ecosystem. Now, after speaking of Maldives, I'll just come back to Bhutan. Now, unlike Maldives, China's tactics in Bhutan have majorly been external. It's majorly been hard military power-based, hard economic power-based, and less to do with its with its inroads within Bhutan. In fact, China had offered assistance to Bhutan on multiple instances, and Bhutan has been willing to decline it on multiple cases, declining Chinese assistance. But what is really working in Chinese favor is not the inroads that is trying to make within, but the inroads that is trying to make by using pressure, by using economic leverages, and by also using military leverages, to be in specific. The Chinese salami slicing has worked efficiently in Bhutan. Since Bhutan and China have a border dispute, Bhutan has now reached a stage where it has agreed that it will be coming to it will be closing its border dispute with China, and it will be marking its border in the next 1 or 2 meetings that it has with China. Now this is where it shows how China has been basically successful in pushing back against pushing back against Bhutan because of its reasons. Just to end up with what I want to talk about Bhutan is the fact that China has consistently made inroads through different tactics, although all of them are related to military. And in recent years, it had continued to have build permanent settlements within Bhutanese territories, and that's where Bhutan has been consistently pushed and pushed to the negotiation table. And this has moreover increased since the 2017 Doklam standoff and the 2020 standoff with Galwan.
Aditya Shivamurthy, thank you so much for that. I just wondered if you could put two things to put in perspective for us, because we've heard a lot recently about the Solomon Islands, which is a very small place, but it seemed to be a great China gain, as it were. These tiny states, where do they sit in China's ambitions of expansion? Are they ticking the boxes to get everywhere, or are they crucial for certain reasons?
I think the reasons are multiple. First is one, that the smaller nations see themselves getting more economic leverages and benefits from China, and that's for obvious reasons that China has to offer. But I think what China's policy is, especially with smaller countries like Maldives or even Sri Lanka, that they pass through crucial sea lines of communications. In fact, that is one of the reasons why China wants to have a stronger say in these island nations. And second thing, it also offers China to push back against the regional powers. In fact, if you keep pushing the Maldives or Sri Lanka against India would be less occupied, to fight against China elsewhere, probably in Southeast Asia or probably in South China Sea. I think that's where, these island nations are becoming crucial for
this is in a way a comparison between the US going into Grenada in the 1980s during the Cold War and that sort of thing. It's just to make sure that or even the Cuban Missile Crisis, just make sure that but then as you mentioned, in 2018, the democracy throughout the pro-China candidate, didn't it? So that just tell us how important, although these democracies are flawed and corrupt and everything like that, that is something quite significant, isn't it?
Right. See, one of the reasons why, Maldives Democratic Party, which is more democratic than the PPM that was led by Yamin, became successful is for the very reason that Yamin's government had been so authoritarian by its sense that it tried, putting all the politicians behind the bars, and also for the fact that Maldivians did realize that at a point of time, most of their leaders were being pushed out. So this was essential reason why, probably the Maldives Democratic Party came out successful. And also the fact that these countries have fought so long for democracy. Maldives had a history of 4 to 5 decades to fight against their dictator Gayoom to establish a democracy. And all of this was just being undone in a span of 5 years. And interesting fact, Yamin was also stepbrother of Gayoom. Yeah. So you see, so you see where this pushback comes from, right?
Just very quick answers to 2 questions. Give me one word answer or something. This is from Ritu Madan, referring to Sri Lanka, but take it as a bigger question. Are accusations of economic colonialism in Sri Lanka, the Maldives, whatever you want to say, justified? Is it economic colonialism? Yes or no?
Of course, it is.
It is. Yes. Okay. And because we're talking about the Maldives, from Rimjin Sud, is China able to overcome the challenge of climate change in South Asia? The Maldives is the most threatened, probably.
In a way, yes, but here's what the transformation is, right? So most of these South Asian nations are also pushing back against China for not having non-renewable projects with them. So it is the demand of the South Asian projects which is also pushing China to adopt to the broader climate change projects or broader renewable energy projects in these countries.
Okay. Thank you very much for that. We will return. And if the other panelists keep in mind those issues that we're talking about, because we're going to go around at the end and wrap all this up. But we now go to Rafaello Pantucci from Singapore's S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies. He's also a senior associate fellow at the Royal United Services Institute here in London. His latest book is Sino-Stan, China's Inadvertent Empire, and he is the founder of the Young China Watches. So he straddles those worlds between China, South Asia, and the West. And interestingly, in one of his latest articles, he argues that China's efforts to portray itself as a peacemaker in some of the world's most complex regions, which we talked about at the beginning, are so far failing to bear fruit. Rafael Pantucci, over to you.
Thank you very much, Humphrey, and thank you to the Democracy for the kind invitation to join you. I mean, other colleagues on the call have covered an awful lot of ground already, so I'm going to maybe be a little bit more concise, and I'll very much be steered by you, Humphrey, as to what I should sort of touch upon beyond that. But I just want to offer some sort of top-line thoughts, which I guess I haven't heard covered yet, maybe, and I just think would offer something for the conversation. I think the first point I'd start with is in some ways picking up on the question, Humphrey, that you kind of ended your comments on to Aditya, which is the question of why is the Sulaiman so significant? Why is China focus so much attention on these small countries? Well, I think we're talking about the border ones that are near it. There's border questions and immediate neighborhood issues, and if you share a border with a country, you have border areas, you tend to have sort of disputes, or you tend to have communities that flow back and forth. So you have a kind of an immediate need. But when we're looking beyond that to like the Solomon Islands, places like that, I actually think one of the underappreciated elements of China's attention to these places is the fact that these countries are all countries. They're very small countries that don't get a lot of attention from anybody, and historically haven't had attention from the West, the United States, or anyone else. And China spends some time with them and spends some focus and effort on them because they also have UN votes, like every other country on the planet. And what this means is China is able to build a much larger body of countries that are going to vote, or at least not vote against it, in the United Nations. And that helps build China's sort of greater strength and posture on the world stage. The Chinese still do venerate the United Nations as kind of a really important institution that they see as kind of the global, the kind of structure of global order. And ultimately, the key kind of Chinese concern in foreign policy concerns is really the United States. And everything else comes as a second order to that. When Beijing or when Xi Jinping or when Chinese leadership in Zhongnanhai wake up in the morning, they don't really think about an awful lot of the other countries that are around them or around the world. They really focus on the United States. And I think what's been most worrying in the past few years is the degree to which they're increasingly looking at every other relationship through this lens as well. And this actually has a detrimental effect in South Asia specifically, because when we look at a country like Afghanistan, where you have a government that's come into power there, the Taliban, who have sort of rejected much of the world and making all sorts of choices that are huge sufferance to their own people, that are causing tensions with a lot of their neighbors. Pakistan, which I think had thought it was in a reasonably good position with the government, the authorities that came into Kabul, has found it incredibly difficult government to actually engage with. This is a country where China in many ways could and should be playing a really prominent and active role. And in fact, when we look at what China is actually doing on the ground, it's actually very limited. What China could be doing and what China should be doing is investing more. It's taking the role of being the country's wealthiest neighbor, that shares a direct border with it, that should be trying to play some sort of an effort in trying to sort of help stabilize it. And yet China is doing pretty much, in many ways, a very similar role to what it has been doing before, under the Republic government, before the Taliban came into power, which is putting some effort in, engaging with the government and the authorities there, mostly to try to bolster them, because they fear that if the government falls, it will lead to some sort of total collapse, and total collapse is worse than what they have now. But they also, are investing not a huge amount, frankly. The two big projects that the Chinese companies, state-backed companies, had signed before under the Republic government was a big copper mine in Messinak, which was, Afghanistan's largest ever investment that was done under the Republic government, which was backed by the United States and NATO. That was a project that was, valued at something between $3 to $4 billion. They signed that contract in 2007 and have really done nothing with it ever since. Up in the north, there was a project in Amudarya, which is essentially an extension of a project that the Chinese company CNPC was doing over the border in Turkmenistan, or has been working on over the border in Turkmenistan. The Chinese company bid for it back in 2010. They dithered around with it so much that in 2018, the Republic government actually pulled the contract from them. And then when the Taliban government came back, CNPCI created a new subsidiary to give themselves some distance and to protect themselves in many ways from the fact that the Taliban government is still full of people who are heavily sanctioned. And then that company went in and actually won the contract back from the Taliban, and they have started to invest. The actual investment is nowhere near the amount that has been thrown around. This sort of value that it's claimed to be somewhere in the region of 150 million per year. It's nowhere near that. The amount that the Chinese company is putting in is far less than that, but they are generating some jobs, and they are actually now getting some oil out of the ground that is being refined in some smaller refineries that have been developed up in the north. They haven't built the big refinery which the Taliban government want. And so, these are the two big state-backed, because they're state-owned enterprises, that we've seen going into the country. All of the other, most of the other big sort of Chinese-supported thing is the re-establishment of a pine nut air corridor, which was essentially a way for Afghan producers of pine nuts to export these to China. The Chinese government essentially subsidized a charter flight that goes back and forth to Shanghai to help get Afghan pine nuts, which are a delicacy, which are widely appreciated in China, to sell to the Chinese market. The Chinese government subsidized this charter flight to go back and forth. It's on Cam Air, I think, is the one that does it. But beyond this, a lot of the other economic activity we've seen on the ground is actually driven by Chinese private entrepreneurs. These are Chinese businessmen who essentially suddenly see Afghanistan as a country that previously was suffering a lot of violence, now is less violent, has a government that doesn't really mind and is eager for investment to come in, and so they're willing to have a go. And the Chinese state just kind of isn't stepping in the way. But the key point here is that the Chinese state itself is not actually doing a huge amount. They're talking up a very big game. They're talking about bringing Afghanistan into the Belt and Road. They're talking about supporting the Afghan government. They're lobbying in the United Nations and other forums to get to accuse the United States and get the United States to release the money that they are blocking from the Afghan government. But in reality, the aid that the Chinese are given is, they are giving some aid. There is no denying that. But in terms of the actual dollar amounts, the United States is still the biggest aid provider to Afghanistan. By a very, very substantial way. Indian companies are actually coming in to try to play a role in Afghanistan as well. So when we're actually looking at what China's doing on the ground, it's actually very little, and they're actually very hesitant. And that's because they're very wary of getting entangled in the situation that's there on the ground, and they'd much rather keep a distance and sort of engage enough to keep the situation sort of stable and moving forward, but without too much to actually find themselves committed and ultimately actually potentially owning the kind of problems that might ultimately emanate from Afghanistan. And I think this kind of plays across the wider region as well. If we look at Pakistan as well, in Pakistan, a relationship which is much vaunted, and both Chinese and Pakistani officials love to talk about, the sort of the all-weather relationship with its, stronger than steel, dearer than eyesight, sweeter than honey, higher than the mountains, and so on and so forth. There is no denying that Chinese companies have, and the Chinese state has invested an awful lot in the China-Pakistan economic corridor. But in reality, the problems that China's encountered on the ground and the trust that doesn't exist between the two governments is very strong. And you do see a very high level of concern in Beijing about Pakistan. And more recently, the concerns that we've seen expressed, or you hear from Beijing towards Pakistan, is a fear that Pakistan might actually be working with the United States, ultimately to potentially undermine their interests. And this is the problem. The Chinese have these neighbors that they built up these relationships that theoretically they should be doing more with, and they have quite important activities, but at the same time they don't really trust them. They don't really trust each other, and they don't really have the same kind of depth of relationship that you should expect. And ultimately, increasingly in Beijing, you're seeing this very high level of paranoia and fear towards anything that might be the States trying to undermine them. So then if we swing around to India, I think where China has made some of its biggest miscalculations, the Chinese consistently have a habit of looking down on India. They don't really take India seriously. They say, this is a country which, is the same size as us, it's true. But, they will go and look at Indian cities and say, well, look at, Delhi and look at Beijing, look at these different cities, look at the wealth that we've accumulated in a very short period of time, the sort of boom economy that you can see in China, the incredible technological advance. And they say, well, the Indians are nowhere near this, so they're just not really a competitor. And the Chinese refuse to kind of accept that the border clashes we saw in 2020 have really led to a real severing in their relationship with India. Instead, they sort of try to ignore it, they try to isolate it, they try to move on. And this has led to a sort of massive miscalculation where, frankly, I think India would like to continue to play this kind of hedging role of not choosing a side with the West or China, but actually trying to play this sort of game of being non-aligned, which it sort of mastered during the Cold War period. But the unfortunate reality is that the Chinese miscalculations, the way that they kind of look down on the Indians, means that they have kind of pushed the Indians out. Even though, in fact, we can still see that China and India do engage in an awful lot of formats. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization is currently chaired by India. Chaired last year. I think the Kazakhs have just taken over chairmanship of it. China and India are both members of BRICS and both invested in the new development bank, the BRICS Development Bank. And we can see the Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank, which was, one of these, this international financial institution that China's created under the Belt and Road. The biggest place that the AIIB was actually investing or spending money in was India. So, this narrative that I think I heard someone else say that, India doesn't take the Belt and Road. Well, India can never accept the Belt and Road or CPEC as a concept, because CPEC in particular, which has been clearly linked to the Belt and Road, goes to disputed territories. They can't sort of acknowledge it in that way. Yet actually, if you look back historically before 2020, and even as I say more recently, if we think about the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, China Belt and Road does actually touch on India in some ways. But because of these kind of wider narratives that the Chinese are pushing, refusing to accept, they are it does create a sort of much higher level of tension there that does sort of exist. But I think the key point, which I would return to, is that I think in an awful lot of these contexts in South Asia, you've got a situation where China is clearly a big player, is clearly an important power, an important economic relation to a lot of these places. But actually, I think in Beijing, from Beijing's perspective, this is not a priority, and this is not necessarily a region of incredibly high concern. I think the border clashes with India are something that do have the potential to escalate up and be much more problematic. But there, the calculation from Beijing's perspective is the Indians just aren't really a peer competitor, so it just doesn't really matter. So they can get away with sort of poking and prodding and doing things there, because ultimately they're doing it against a power that they don't really rate as a genuine threat or a genuine concern. What they do see as a genuine threat is the United States. And I think the specter of the United States is ultimately what really hangs in the background of China's concerns across this region, and actually, in fact, most of the world. And Humphrey, I'll pause there, and I'm happy to pick up on any questions.
Yes, I want to not pick you up. I want to expand on a couple of points you made, and then ask an overwhelming question to you and the panel, but you talk about China seeing everything through a US narrative. Is it the case that the US is now seeing everything through a China narrative, and that's why we're having that? Not we, but that's why we're talking about this. When you're saying actually it's not such a big deal.
So I think that the US has caught this bug to some degree. I think this sort of this disease of having this single-minded obsession with another power. For years the Chinese had it. And for years I think the Chinese were frustrated in some ways because they saw themselves and they see themselves. This narrative of 100 years of humiliation. They look back in history and say we were the world's greatest power. They love to quote that great that apocryphal story that I think it's Napoleon supposed to have said it. Looked at a map of the world and pointed to China and said, when that dragon wakes, the world will shake, or something like that. They love those sorts of things, which essentially elevate them to being this global straddling giant. And for the longest time they weren't really treated as that, and the fact that they are now on the one hand is incredibly threatening because they fear that the United States is trying to keep them down. But on the other hand, it's quite empowering because it's very much the sense that we have risen now. We are competing with the world's hegemon. And I think the United States has caught this bug to some degree. I would say, however, that recently, I think, while it's undoubtedly, if you look at sort of American security agents, they talk obsessively about China and the China threat through all sorts of different lenses. I think you have seen, at least coming out of the State Department, an attempt in American diplomacy to try to disengage from it a little bit. Because it is a problem if you're going to other parts of the world, and you go there and you start banging onto them about China. I mean, I've been very lucky in recent months to go to Central Asia quite a bit, and I've been struck at a couple of engagements where I've heard American speakers essentially suddenly start talking about Taiwan in Central Asia, and my audience, my Central Asian colleagues, say, what on earth are they talking about? And because the kind of American speaker is so locked into this narrative of China, Taiwan, the threat, everyone needs to be agitated about this. It kind of misses the point. And the region says, well, hold on, we're, landlocked Central Asia. What earthly help? What do we care about this? I mean,
a bit, I suppose, like, a lot of people in the global south mentioned that, what's Ukraine got to do with this? It's just another European war. But you made reference to the UN General Assembly. And we've heard earlier how China's sort of swaying votes there. Do you think this is going to be, with the UN Security Council pretty much paralyzed and deadlocked, is this going to be a new powerful institution that we're going to be talking about more of?
I think, look, at the end of the day, this is not a body that can do things in the sense that the doing is done by the powers in the member states. And they elect to do it or not, and they do it for their own reasons. They don't do it because the UN General Assembly tells them to do it. And that is the reality of the United Nations. It's an organization that exists essentially by tacit agreement by its members. It doesn't actually have a kind of standing army that it can mobilize, or massive funds that it can deploy. So
that's the same for the Security Council, isn't it? As well, you can violate a Security Council agreement, nobody can do anything about it.
Sadly so, but it carries a lot of moral authority, and I think that's the really crucial part, and that's what the Chinese quite like, and this is why it's so important to them, is the moral weight of it. So the fact that they can get discussions on Xinjiang shut out of this conversation means that conversation is not happening, and it means that this sort of global body isn't condemning them in that way, and therefore they can say, well, obviously it's not as bad as the Americans say, because look, the UN disagree with it, and the UN is the world body, so obviously the world doesn't mind what we're doing. So there is a moral authority that does come from these institutions, and being able to sort of control the narratives that come out of them is important, and is, I think, the element that is relevant within it. It's not so much that the body can do something, it's the weight that it carries of being the voice of the world.
Thanks. There's an Afghan question that's come in from a member of the audience that I'd like to put to you, and then to Sadia Sulaiman, and we're going to go back round again with another question. But is it not true that China is getting close to Taliban-led Islamic Emirati only because to counter the East Turkestan Islamic movement, which has bases in Afghanistan, and China wants to prevent them from radicalizing Uyghurs in Xinjiang? Just a line of comment on that.
I think it is their major concern. Yes, there's no denying that. It is their major concern. I think it's an overblown concern, to be honest, because I think all reports indicate that at most there's a couple of hundred militant Uyghurs in Afghanistan, and we have not seen an attack emanating from Afghanistan into China. I think the last attack you can point to where there was any evidence of this was one back in 2011. All other violence subsequent to that has mostly seemingly come from within Xinjiang, from angry people there, rather than cells directed from outside. So yes, it is. Having said that, it is the first issue that the Chinese always raise with the Taliban authorities, and they want them to deal with, and they worry about it. But at the same time, how much of an actual concern it is I think limited.
Okay, thank you. Sadia, Sulaiman, could I have your thoughts on that? And then very briefly, and then I want to put you the question that we're going to put to the whole panel as we go back round again. Sadia? Are you muted? Can we hear you? No, we cannot. One more try, and then I'm going to, we'll come back to you, Sadia, once we have your audio sorted out. And one more try, and we'll go on to Asanga Abeyagoonasekera on the overwhelming question from Anand Singh Tomar. Just a thought on this. How is China's presence in the region reshaping South Asia? Are you there?
Yes.
Yes.
I have.
And it's really your final thoughts on the discussion under that question. How is China's presence reshaping South Asia?
No, it's reshaping South Asia in several ways. One is the economic dimension. So it's very clear in countries like Sri Lanka. Aditya mentioned about Maldives, then Sadia on Pakistan. So the economic as well as the volume of assistance, they are not slowed down. Even after the crisis in Sri Lanka, there have been multiple visits of Chinese delegations to Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka is in the process with the Chinese government. You see Chinese giving more loans rather than talking about restructuring. So China is fully engaged. So I think this would sort of increase, it wouldn't sort of slow down the economic side. But when it comes to soft diplomacy as well as in engagement, political establishments, it will also sort of, they will play a huge role. So the security side is another area. So the strategic trap I mentioned, so all three areas will be at play.
Thank you so much for that. Sadia, do we have you back again?
Yeah. Can you hear me now?
Yes. Can you give us a very quick line on the Afghanistan question that we mentioned, and then how is China's presence in the region reshaping South Asia? Just a line on each.
For Afghanistan, China, I agree with Sayyid Ajmal's view that basically it's not only there to control ETIM or to counter ETIM, but there are other regional economic and political objectives which China has, which we discussed, in detail. And yes, China's presence in the region is affecting the region in a way that now we are expecting that maybe its role would go beyond the economic role only, and it will play a role as a peace broker or maybe managing the region overall in terms of engaging various states, especially Pakistan, Afghanistan, India, and all that. So yes, it is reshaping the South Asian region to a greater extent, but of course the complexities remain the same.
Is that a good or a bad thing?
Maybe we are adding one more stakeholder to a very complex geopolitical scenario. So for me, it's good and bad both.
That's a great answer. Aditya Shivamati, how is China reshaping South Asia?
Okay, I precisely see multiple ways in how China is reshaping South Asia. One and most important part of it is the agency that China's that small states are now trying to play around since China has come here. So there are new partners in the region. There will still be more partners coming in. Japan, US, Australia, we see renewed interest in these players. France, which is also an Indo-Pacific power. The second thing is also the new economic partnerships are coming in, not only from China, but also to counter China. There are the Quad countries which are trying to invest in South Asia. And obviously, with China's presence, there is also a huge, that huge attraction that South Asia gains as a prominent center of Indo-Pacific. That means that South Asia will be a hot contested center for geopolitics. There will be lasting impact on democracy and domestic politics, as Asanga has pointed out. And I think this will persist. This will persist for a long time. So this is what I think. It's going to be an intense and.
So I can ask you, Sadia, is it a good or a bad thing?
Depends on which side of the value-based order you stand on.
Which side are you on?
Well, I'm on the defending of the value-based order thing, precisely coming from where I come from. So, yes.
Thank you. Rafaello, Pantucci, how is China's inroads reshaping South Asia?
I mean, I think it's clearly changing physically an awful lot. If we think of just the sort of infrastructure that China has built and the investments that they're offering, it is changing a lot. But I'd hesitate to say it's a kind of an earth-shattering game changer. It's really going to change a lot. I think it might be supercharging a lot of things. It's certainly supercharged India's kind of push to become a kind of greater, more autonomous power, because it sees a kind of peer competitor it's bouncing off, and that's clearly going to be hugely significant given the size of India and the player it can be. I think in some other countries, the investments have had positive and negative effects, to be perfectly honest, and I think that is dependent on one. But I think in terms of the broad picture, I'm not sure I see China actually stepping in to play that kind of game-changing role. Its activity has that effect sometimes because of the volume and the size, but I see it still as an actor that ultimately, it doesn't assume the same kind of role. We kind of, in some ways, we talk about it sometimes that China is trying to kind of be the US, and it is trying to be the US in some ways, but in other ways, it really isn't. It kind of, I can't remember who it was who said this, who said that China just kind of watches what's happening and then picks up the piece and hooks up with whoever comes out on top. That's always the way. And to continue to do that, which means that you're always friends with everybody, means you just don't pick sides. So you don't actually want to really reshape things in such a way that you ultimately get completely cut out. And I think that's ultimately the choice that they make. And ultimately, they see this as a region that should be just generally, one that wants to trade with them and kind of just work with them and leave everybody alone.
Thank you for that. It stops complacency, I guess. Always good to have a rival around, isn't it? Now it is time that we draw to the end of our Democracy Forum debate to bring in the wisdom of our chair, Barry Gardiner MP, who is steeped in the ups and downs of South Asia and has been listening. Barry, what do you make of our discussion?
You'll wait a long time, Humphrey, if you're waiting for the wisdom of the chair, I suspect. Can I first of all thank all our contributors? I've really enjoyed today's session. And you actually started off with an interesting point. You said, are countries signing up to China's infrastructure investment because the West has come up with nothing? It's a question I would have enjoyed our panelists responding to. I'm not quite sure that they did, but then it wasn't the title of today's seminar, China's growing inroads into South Asia. But I think it's an interesting question. As always, indebted to Charles for his sparkling introduction. He brought us right up to date with the Foreign Ministers' Conference in Indonesia. He talked about the systemic differences undermining trust between the countries. Yes, talked about CPEC, the Maritime Silk Road, India and China's relationship and the competition for influence. And it was, again, interesting when he highlighted Foreign Minister Jaishankar's speech about the conflict in Ladakh, and how really that sort of imperative that Jaishankar laid down, that China needed to demilitarize on the line of actual control there. he set out how China wants to neutralize India as a rival power, and the twin track strategy, that is, talks that seem to be peaceful, seem to be cooperative, but then undermined by military provocation in effect. And he said that Delhi was more likely to invest more where it has become less popular than China. I thought that was a very, very interesting, very astute, very political comment. Yes, all politicians know that when you're beginning to lose popularity in an area, whether it's a particular department of government or whatever, that's the area you need to pay particular attention to. And of course, set out Sri Lanka's 20% of debt to China, Pakistan hobbled by CPEC, Bangladesh's 70% of arms purchases, and then address the Carnegie Endowment meeting with China's interests, not solely economic, but a matter of power projection and influence projection, and capture of influencers. Now, can I just say, one of the things I most enjoyed about today was started off by Dr. Sadia Sulaiman, because she gave us clear points, 1, 2, 3, 4, and I can't tell you how wonderful that is for someone like me who's trying to sum up a conversation at the end of a very broad-ranging afternoon. She posed how CPEC will be extended into Afghanistan, and Pakistan's initial view was diverse economic opportunity to provide millions of jobs, but now indicated that was fraught with the delays because of the political turmoil and China's refusal to restructure Pakistan's debt. She talked about the extension of CPEC, but highlighted 4 key challenges, very helpfully setting those out. Complex geopolitical scenario of the region, which has too many conflicts, and obviously India's involvement, SARC unable to connect states as it was initially intended to do, and to create those bonds of fellowship and trade. Her second challenge was the persistent domestic instability in Afghanistan, and after 2001, China did a number of mining and drilling deals, but really nothing particularly serious, and now reluctant to get further involved. And she said even Pakistan has not recognized Taliban officially because of the concern over a terrorist organization. She said China was reluctant, the capacity for that terrorism to flow over into neighboring territories. Her third challenge was on political chaos in Pakistan, and we've seen the fallout from that all across the media here with Imran Khan, and now the work on special economic zones, that sort of stop-start that's been going on, and the elections to be taking place shortly, and the problems of the caretaker government. So again, all of this getting in the way. And then I thought one of the really most interesting aspects that she dealt with was the experience of China, when she talked about the socio-cultural differences and how they might pose a problem for its non-interference policy. Interesting to begin to see that actually what I quote of the day, of course, was I'm on the defending of the values-based order thing, which I think it was Aditya that said that right at the end when you were talking to him, Humphrey. But this values-based, and the implication that Dr. Sulaiman gave us was that actually this could become a real challenge for China in its involvement in Afghanistan. I'd certainly like to probe that further with her. But she acknowledged CPEC could bring real benefits for impoverished communities, health, transport infrastructure, but so far delayed. Briefly, you and she talked about the sacking of Jingang and the return of Wang Yi and how that might affect China's foreign policy. and spoke of China's objectives here, where she highlighted the 7 bottleneck routes and the desire to create those economic corridors to deliver economic benefit. So let me move on to the comments by Asanga Abeyagoonasekera. Speaking about China's inroads into Sri Lanka, and of course focusing on the protests last year, which overthrew the president and demanded those reforms. 3 factors, again, thank you very much for setting it out so clearly, made my job a lot easier. The 3 factors: 1, the unsustainability of the projects, no revenue to repay the loans, that debt trap diplomacy that so many of the conversations kept coming back to, no proper oversight, the informality of the processes, and China's strategic trap. An interesting thought here. Spoke about the interest rates of the Hambantota port, but talked about political funding, human rights support to Sri Lanka, but basically human rights denial, and the military and security assistance. And this concept of an elite capture being at the heart of China's policy. He spoke of the domestic political environment, the way in which the pandemic had enabled a centralization of rule and the autocracy that had followed in the militarization, that really had led to a family kleptocracy for a government, but how that was supported by China. And I thought it was very interesting when he set out the different elements, all supported by Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Myanmar, the Maldives, and so on. Hong Kong national security law, the South China Sea arbiter, the Xinjiang policies, Huawei and 5G, and how there's this bringing together of people who, because of their dependence upon China economically, politically, strategically, are not taking the route of values-based policies, but are actually siding with China on some pretty dodgy stuff, if I can put it in the vernacular. He spoke of the future trajectory and the GSI, GDI, GCI for China's policies, the cultural and research support, the soft power, and the way in which the anti-terror bill, the Broadcasting Act was similar in Bangladesh. And I thought an interesting point when he said that the Ukrainian distraction had allowed China to take advantage in the Solomon Islands. You and he spoke, Humphrey, about the constitutionality of one person via bonus seat in parliament becoming president. And that really chimed rather nicely with something that was brought out later on by Rafaello Pantucci when he was speaking about why does China focus on small countries? Well, very simple. And they have one vote at the UN just like everybody else does. And it's a very cheap vote to get on your side. But, you know, not quite as cheap as a bonus seat in the parliament to get to be president. Focusing now though on Aditya Shivamurthy, he started off by breaking this down into the geography of the Maldives and Bhutan and taking these 2 individuals. So spoke about the strategic importance of the Maldives for the sea lines of the Indian Ocean and obviously its traditional closeness politically and economically to India. And that was what made it a target for China. He asserted that Bhutan is not a part of the BRI and that China wants to bring it on board, but also spoke significantly about the resolution of the border disputes. He then shifted from the geography to the history, spoke of the Chinese presence in South Asia, how it had tripled in the 2000s, the Maldives president. I'm afraid I'm probably going to get the series of presidential names wrong here. So in the 1980s, how they visited Beijing, but the economic might now bringing Maldives into China's orbit. President Nasheed's successor supporting the new president in 2020. Yamin's pro-China presidency, creating a debt trap which had in effect shackled the country thereafter. And how Yamin's successor, Ibu Soli, I think it is, who appealed to India to help out with that. Again, spoke of Bhutan and the land disputes on the border, 25% of the landmass of the country. Now, even though it's a small country, well, perhaps especially because it's a small country, 25% of your landmass being under dispute to a very significant, powerful neighbor is a huge problem for a country. And in 2019, the new claims for the western part of the country that had been made in violation of the 1994 agreement. So some really interesting stuff there. And again, saying when China saw the political instability in the Maldives with the Yamin government, it pursued it to bring it on board into the BRI, this taking advantage when there is political instability, a rather predatory presence in the region, if you view it in that way. So Rafaello Pantucci really tried to bring a number of the themes together. Why does China focus on small countries? Well, we said because they've got a vote at the UN. And China looking at all its other relationship through the lens of its relationship with the United States. And, you know, something that I was surprised that nobody mentioned in our discussion is the recent visit of Kissinger. 6 days ago, Kissinger was there meeting with President Xi in Beijing. In marked contrast, Kerry, even though he had visited earlier in the month, was not afforded the luxury or the honor of a meeting with President Xi. But the 100-year-old Kissinger was. And why? Because China is harking back to a time when its relationship with America was beginning on a much more friendly course, and that was the start, the Kissinger diplomacy, that secret diplomacy that Kissinger played in 1971. But how important that is in the Chinese psyche, I think, is really important. And at the end, when you were talking about Napoleon and China liking to use those quotes about the awakening of the dragon, I think it's important that we understand how important face is in China. Yes, it's a shame culture in one sense, but actually that sense of face, that sense of not losing face is really, really important. And therefore, to be able to make Kerry lose face, to make Janet Yellen lose face, because they were not given the same august treatment as Kissinger, we have to read into that a very clear diplomatic message that China wants to reestablish a better relationship. It feels Kissinger was the architect of that and therefore is fated. But the current administration, with its focus on China, its perceived hostility to China, it has been precluded and lost face, as the Chinese would see it, by not being given the same meeting. Rafaello spoke of Chinese investment in Afghanistan, again emphasizing really how historical and minimal it is. I like that idea of the pine nut diplomacy. If that's really the best that they can do, then affording people in Beijing a few luxurious pine nuts, that's not the basis for a great economic cooperation. The private sector much more involved than the Chinese government, who are keeping their distance despite the rhetoric. And Beijing doesn't trust Pakistan because, of course, Pakistan still has those very strong relations with America, indeed with the UK, and understandably, therefore, Beijing not being entirely confident that CPEC has provided the sense of security that it wants and the solidarity and the relationship that it wants. I thought it was interesting. China has underestimated India, a point that Rafaello Pantucci supported. All I would say is, if China is underestimating India, then I think we would all suggest it's making a very big mistake. But a fascinating afternoon, fascinating discussion. Very grateful to the clear order in which our panelists presented their points this afternoon, which assisted me enormously in regurgitating them. Yeah, and interested, Humphrey, in any final thoughts that you might have.
No, I'm just fascinated. We are over time, but fascinated about your Kissinger analogy there, which is which was something that is really. But we have no more time for discussion, and we have covered a lot of ground. Thank you, Barry Gardiner. Thank you, panelists Sadia Sulaiman, Asanga Abeyagoonasekera, Aditya Shivamurti, Rafael Pantucci, and thank you, Lord Charles Bruce, for so skillfully giving us our backdrop for our debate. Read all about Asia, South Asia, and all these issues in Asian Affairs, which is our sister publication. Our next debate is August the 16th, Drivers of China's Nuclear Buildup. Join us then at the usual time with a sterling panel, 2 p.m. London, but from me, Humphrey Hawksley, and the team at Asian Affairs and the Democracy Forum. Thank you for being here, and until next month, goodbye.
Thank you.
Oh,